Last week I wrote a devotional on the scripture that we look at this morning, and I mentioned that one of my favorite movies is the movie Hoosiers. You say, well, of course it is. You're from Indiana. It is, but it's a favorite because in a real sense, it's a more modern illustration of the story that we're going to look at today. It's really a classic David and Goliath basketball matchup, and that's what I like about it. Back in the day, Indiana didn't have a class system like most states do, so little schools could take on the big school. It's sad, years ago they changed that, so what happened in the movie Hoosiers could never happen today, unfortunately. But anyway, back in the day, when they didn't have a class system, any school could go the whole distance. And that's what the movie's about. It's maybe loosely based upon a true story, but there was a small town high school. In reality, I think it was called Hickory in the movie, but it was actually the town of Milan, Indiana. And they went up against the heavily favored big city team, which I don't remember the name in the movie, but in reality it was Muncie Central School. And they went up and they won the state championship at Butler University's Hinkle Fieldhouse. It's a big deal. And anyway, I like it again for two reasons. Again, because it resonates with the Hoosier, but also it really is a David and Goliath kind of a story, which takes us to 1 Samuel chapter 17, which is really the story of David and Goliath. And you think about it, it's almost seems like it couldn't possibly be a true story. But it really is. It really was a historic thing that happened. It seems outrageous to be true, but it really is. And anybody that ever has gone to a Sunday school class has heard the story. It's the ultimate superhero story of all times. And so anyway, the story of David and Goliath, we want to take a look at it this morning and draw out, I think, some very fresh and relevant applications for us. So we're just going to spend a lot of time in the passage itself, reading it, because it's a story that just has to be read. I could tell the story, but it wouldn't be nearly as good as what we read. So if you're open in your Bibles and whatever translation you have, I'm going to use this morning the Holman translation. I just like the way that it renders this chapter. But we jump right into the first three verses that tell us that the Philistines gathered their forces for war. Verse 2 says that King Saul, and the men of Israel gathered as well. And verse 3, the Philistines were standing on one hill, and the Israelites were standing on another hill with a ravine between them. I jump down to verse 16, and it says that every morning and evening for 40 days, the Philistine, singular, describing an individual focus on, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. We'll come back to that, but picture that in your mind. You've got two armies every single day that face off on two hills separated by a ravine. They face off. Apparently they never engage in battle, but they face off, and they do this for 40 days. Now, in particular, there is one member of the Philistine army that caused a real problem. Verses 4 to 7, and again, I like how this translation renders this, because we get a bit more of an idea of who this guy Goliath really was. Verse 4 says there was a champion named Goliath from Gath, and he came out from the Philistine camp. Here's what I like, because maybe our other translations we don't get so much of an idea of his size. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall, and he should have been in the movie Hoosiers, because if you got a 10-foot goal, I'm thinking that guy could very easily reach the thing. 9 feet 9 inches tall, and wore a bronze helmet and bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. There was bronze armor on his shins, and a bronze sword was slung between his shoulders. I'm thinking hanging in his back. And his spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. I'd call that a giant of a man. That's a formidable foe. That's somebody to be afraid of. So for 40 days, the two armies are facing off. Well, of course, that's all you're going to do is face off, because if there's somebody like that on the other side, who in the world wants to engage, literally, that kind of a giant in battle? So verses 8 to 10 says that he stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formations, "Why do you come out to line up in battle formation?" He asked them, "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other." So you didn't have this giant of a man said, "Bring on the army." Now he said, "I want a duel. I want one man." Where are you going to find another 9-foot, 9-inch man that's a match for him? And so, understandably, for 40 days, all they're doing is facing off. They just want one man to come down and fight, and then however it goes, the other side that loses is going to be servants to the others. And so those were the stakes in this whole thing. Verse 11, it says that when Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. Jumping down to verse 24, it says, when all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him terrified. So, then we come down to a boy named David. Yeah, we talked about singing that chorus. You know it. Many of you know it. But anyway, introduce to you a young man named David in verse 12. Now, David was the son of the Ephrathite from Bethlehem of Judah named Jesse. Jesse had 8 sons, and during Saul's reign was already an old man. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war, and their names were Eliab, the firstborn, Abinadab, the next, and I think Shammah, the third, and David was the youngest. Joe was talking in Sunday school class about the meaning of names. There better be a good meaning to those names, because who names their kids that these days? Anyway, so we have David introduced to us in the story. Well, you know how the story goes, but it's just kind of fun to follow along and see how this thing happens. So as the story goes on, there was a particular day when David's father Jesse decided to send David down to the battlefront to take some food to his brothers, to take some food to the commanders of the army. And on that particular day, as you read into the chapter, on that particular day, like every other day for those 40 days, the giant of a man named Goliath, 9 foot 9 inches tall, came out along with the Philistine army, and they came out to taunt the Israelites. And so no doubt there's a lot of chatter going on in the camp as David comes down, talks to the fighting men, and he's asking them, well, what's going to happen for the person that defeats that giant? And so they talk about everything that King Saul has said. He will reward that one person that will go out and fight this giant of a man. Anybody who could go kill Goliath, he would give him great riches, some great riches. He would also give his daughter in marriage to that person who would do so. And he would enjoy a tax-free life in the land. I'm thinking the third part really appeals a whole lot. But anyway, those are the 3 things that were offered to anybody that could go up and kill that giant of a man. So verse 26 records David's response. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Right away, we kind of get David's heart. It's not about who's toughest here. It's not about my pride and my arrogance. I can take him on. He's offended for the reputation and the name of God, the army of the living God. Who is this who would dare stand up against the armies of the living God? And so as the story goes here, there's a report about the conversation that David has with the fighting men. The report goes back to King Saul, and King Saul wants to know about this guy that potentially thinks he can take on the giant. And so David comes before Saul. They have some conversation. Verse 32, and I like this. Don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go out and fight this Philistine. David, the little shepherd boy, I don't know how old he was at that time, but he certainly wasn't 9 foot 9 inches tall, a young man. And here he rather confidently makes this declaration, I'll go out and I'll fight this Philistine. So verse 33, Saul replied, you can't go fight this Philistine, you're just a youth. And he's been a warrior since he was young. So you're just a kid. And Goliath, who obviously is an adult at this point, he's been fighting as a warrior since he was a kid. And so not only has he got size on his side, but he's got a great deal of experience. Verse 37. We jump down to David's basis for the confidence that he has as he's about to go off and fight this giant of a man. Verse 37, he says, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. His confidence is not in his own ability. He knows he's outmanned, outgunned. But he says, God has been doing this in my life. As a shepherd, I've faced a lot of wild animals, and it was God who always delivered me. God delivered me from the paw of the lion that would devour me, the paw of the bear. And I know it was God who did it, and I know as assuredly as God has done that for me with animals, He'll do the same thing with this giant of a man. So verses 38 and 39, it says, then Saul had his own military clothes put on David. He put a bronze helmet on David's head and had him put on armor. And David strapped his sword over the military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them. I can't walk in these, David said to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off. I picture that scene. I'm picturing this scrawny kid. Saul's no doubt a big man. And so Saul's armor is put on David, puts it on, and I'm sure it fits pretty loose and pretty big. And so you picture David with all that on, taking Saul's sword and trying to walk. I can't even walk in this. How am I going to go out and do battle? And so he takes the armor off. He is obviously clothed in the wrong armor. We'll come back to that thought here in just a little bit too. So instead, as you know the story, he takes the most unlikely of weapons. Verse 40. After he had taken off Saul's armor, it said instead he took his staff, his shepherd's staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his pouch, in his shepherd's bag, and then with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. Game on, we might say. So, the game is the interesting part, verses 41 to 44. The Philistine came closer and closer to David, with the shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. And he said to David, am I a dog that you come out against me with sticks? And then he cursed David by his gods. Come here, the Philistine called to David, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts. Verse 45, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a dagger, spear, and sword, but I come against you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel's armies. You have defied him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, cut off your head, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the creatures of the earth. Then all the earth will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us. Verse 48, when the Philistine started forward to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag, and he took out a stone, slung it, and it hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Even though David had no sword, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from its sheath, and used it to kill him. Then he cut off his head. And when the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they ran. The men of Israel and Judah rallied, shouting their battle cry, and chased the Philistines to the entrance of the valley, to the gates of Ekron. Philistine bodies were strewn all along the road. And I won't even bother to pronounce the names. And when the Israelites returned from the pursuit of the Philistines, they plundered their camps. David took Goliath's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put Goliath's weapons in his own tent. You know, Jill and I were talking about this story this week. Kind of a barbaric time back then, wasn't it? But what an amazing story. An amazing and unlikely victory. And as I thought about this great story, I thought there are some tremendous lessons, tremendous applications for us out of what we might take as just an old Sunday school story. So let's back up and draw out some things that mean something to us today. Go back to the setting of the whole story. Every day, for 40 days, the men of Israel faced off in battle against Goliath and against the Philistines. Again, picture it. They put on their armor, they took up their weapons, but all they ever did for 40 days was to face each other. Now let's talk about our enemies and our giants, because we all have them. And we'll talk about the names of those in a little bit. But there are enemies in our lives. We are in a battle ourselves. There are giants in our lives. And sometimes, when you think about it, we do basically the same thing. We might kind of go through the motions as though we're going to fight a war, that we're going to deal with the enemies in our lives. We're going to deal with the giants in our lives. But in essence, all we may ever do is stand there staring down the giants and the enemies in our lives. And you know, if that's all we do, we're not going to really get very far with that. It's not going to be very, very helpful, because what's going to happen to us is what happened to the Israelite army. As it said in verse 11, they were dismayed and they were greatly afraid. So again, think about your giants. Think about your enemies, whatever they might be. Think about them, and if that's all you're doing on a day-to-day basis is looking and saying, wow, yeah, I'm in battle, I've got enemies, I've got some towering giants, and I'm fearful and I'm dismayed because all I'm doing day in and day out is sizing up the giants and the enemies, and that's really not going to be terribly productive. Again, it says in the story they did this for 40 days. I pause when I see the number 40. 40 is always a significant number in the Bible, isn't it? Time and time again, we come back to the number 40. Go back to Genesis. How long did it rain in the days of Noah? 40 days and 40 nights. We think about Moses when God called him out to Mount Sinai to give him the 10 Commandments and the law. How long was he there? 40 days. What about the people of Israel after they had been disobedient? When they were called to go into the promised land, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Again, that number. And Jesus, after his baptism, he was led by the Spirit out into the desert, out into the wilderness for 40 days. 40 is considered to be a number of testing. And so it probably is very significant in the story here that after 40 days of doing this thing where they faced off with the giant and with the enemies, after they had gone through a period of testing, 40 days of doing this, likely they were ready for what God was about to do through a young man named David. They were ready for God's solution. The lesson and the application from that for us is when we finally get tired of staring down our giants and our enemies, when we finally reach the point of saying, this is getting nowhere, I'm fearful and dismayed, I'm deadlocked in this routine in my life, when we get to that point, it is then that we're ready for God to do His greatest work. We're ready for God to bring deliverance into our lives. And so in a sense, we need to get this out of our system as well. Again, thinking about Goliath, a 9-foot, 9-inch giant with 125 pounds of armor and a 15-pound spearhead. If we look at that giant long enough, we will reach the conclusion also that we face a formidable foe. and thinking about the giants in our lives that we might spend way too much time staring down and looking at, well, we're going to reach that conclusion. This is a terrible battle. The odds are against me. The giants are greater than I am. And so maybe we need to spend a little bit of time staring down the giant before the solution comes. And you think about the giants in our lives. Let's get personal about what some of those giants might be. What are the giants that are in our lives? Well, they might be fear. And I don't know over what, but there can certainly be things that cause us to be fearful. And the fear that builds up in our lives can seem like a 9-foot, 9-inch giant. The giant might be some form of an addiction that we have in our life. It might be an unbelieving spouse. It might be a prodigal child. It might just be the severe hardships that you happen to be going through right now that tower like a giant in your life. The insurmountable odds that seem stacked against you. A temptation that you just can't seem to find a way out of or around that seems like a towering giant. Or just some threat that seems to come to bear against your life. There are indeed giants in our lives. And you know, Satan, our enemy, the devil, likes to taunt us with those giants, just like Goliath taunted the people of Israel, where it says that the Philistine cursed David by his gods and said, "Come to me and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." Sometimes the giants in our lives seem like that. They're taunting, and the enemy likes to do that. Look, you call yourself a child of God, but look what's going to happen to you. You're one step away from disaster and defeat. And sometimes we listen to the taunting. We listen to the voice. And again, we're terrorized like the people of Israel were as well. One thing about Goliath, the giant, was there was a time when he wasn't a giant. He started out like everybody else as a little baby. Well, maybe he was a big baby, I don't know. But nevertheless, there was a time when he was a tiny infant. There was a time when he wasn't 9 foot 9 inches tall. The point being, the giants that come in our lives, the giants that look 9 foot 9 inches tall, those giants were something small at one point. But somehow, in some way, those things grew. And they grew, and maybe then now they stand before us as some looming, menacing kind of a giant. Goliath the giant and the Philistine army, as the story goes, had come in and invaded the land of Israel. They had come in literally into God's territory, into a place where they had no right to be. And that's what David was indignant about. The enemy has come in, and look at what's happening, taunting the armies of the living God. They're in a place where they don't belong. And you think about whatever giant or giants might be in our lives. Same thing. They've come to intrude into our lives, our territory, and they don't belong there because they never came from God, because God would never bring menacing giants into our lives. James chapter 1, verse 17 tells us what it is that God brings to us. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. And so if there's something in our life that's menacing and it's taunting, if it appears to be a giant, you can bet it never came from God. It is an enemy of us. It is an enemy of God as well. And so when it came time for battle, when it came time for David to face off with Goliath, it says here that David ran quickly to the battle line. So it is with the giants in our lives. The giants that have come into the territory of our lives that don't belong there because they didn't come from God in our own lives. When it comes time to deal with the giants, we need to do like David. We need to run quickly to the battle line. And so in essence, we don't run away from those giants. We don't try to negotiate with them. We fight the giants in that territory where they do not belong. Someone has said this, and I think it's a great commentary on what happens when we don't deal with the giants in our lives. This writer says, the problem is that when we surrender to a giant, especially one of the modern day variety, we give up more than just a fight. We give up control over our own lives, handing the reins over to Satan himself. When we decide beforehand that we can't win these battles, we forfeit any hope of growth, of overcoming, and of breaking free. Choosing not to fight means embracing stagnancy and accepting defeat as a lifestyle. I think that is spot on. If there are enemies and giants in our lives that we know have not come from God, and if we decide to back down, if we decide to run away, if we accept defeat as a lifestyle, it'll always be that way, won't it? And so whatever it is, habits that shouldn't be a part of our lives, addictions, or all those other kinds of things that come to mind, those negative things, those giants, if we just accept defeat as a lifestyle, that's the way it'll always be, and that is totally inconsistent with the life of a follower of Jesus Christ. I'm thinking about David putting on Saul's armor. Sometimes, in a sense, we do the same thing. Sometimes we try to wage war with the wrong armor and with the wrong weapons. Again, David put on Saul's armor. It didn't fit. It was armor designed for Saul, not for David. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 to 5 says that though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Now that's a real description of the war that we're in. And the giants that are around us are human philosophies, arrogantly raised up against the Word of God and the truth of God. And so those things that are raised up, those towering giants in our society, and we look at them and say, how in the world can you do battle with those? We do them in the way that David did. David took unlikely weapons, and I don't think the stone and the sling were really the determining factor. It was God's mighty power that took the unlikely and brought about victory, and God does the same thing with us. We got to fight the battle according to the reality of the battle. We don't go out and fight spiritual warfare with bullets and tanks and airplanes. We fight it with the Word of God and with prayer. And so we have to use the appropriate weapons for the kind of battle that we're engaged in. Ephesians 6, 11 to 17. You don't need to turn there, but you may be very, very familiar with that we battle not against flesh and blood, but against angels and principalities, spiritual forces in high places, and we put on the armor of God, the helmet of salvation, and the shield of faith, and the breastplate of righteousness, and so forth. And so that's the battle, and that's what we use to fight the battle. One other lesson out of this great story, maybe this is the most important of all. The battle is not ours, but it is God's. The battle that we are engaged in belongs to God because we belong to Him. And so this is not about us. This is not our battle. Again, you think about a scrawny young shepherd boy. How could he possibly have ever defeated a well-armed giant of a man using only a sling and stones? He could do so because it wasn't his battle. It was God's battle, and so God brought His power and might and forces to bear to win the war. I think the great takeaway is verses 45 to 47, to go back to that, because it sums up the confidence that David had not in himself, but in the God that he knew. He said to Goliath, "You come against me with a dagger, spear, and sword, but I come against you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel's army. You have defied Him, and all the world is going to know that Israel has a God. And this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's." The battle that we're engaged in is not about us. It is about God's reputation and the reputation of His Son, Jesus Christ. And so when it's about their reputation, it's not about us. It's about what they will do and the victory and the fame that rightfully goes to them. Again, we face down the giants in our lives. We face them down not with dagger and spear and sword, but we face them in the name of Yahweh, God of Israel. And again, we gain the victory not for ourselves, but for God, for His name, and His reputation. One thought I want to leave you with out of this story. I just absolutely love this. I think I've included it in your outline. But here's one real important takeaway from this very old story. Don't look at God in the light of your giants. Instead, look at your giant in the light of God.